Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. I do appreciate it. I said to someone yesterday, either I am clairvoyant or you are thoroughly predictable. I wasn't very happy with them. The typical hotspot is a momentary conflict between the words spoken and the sound of the voice, the gesture or the facial expression. Just as important are very brief micro-expressions that can flash across a person's face in 1/25th of a second. A micro looks exactly like a normal facial expression, except it is so fast that most people don't see it. It always is a sign of a concealed emotion, sometimes deliberately concealed, sometimes repressed emotion, just as important as a slight edge in the voice that doesn't fit calm words. That's Paul Ekman, who really is an extraordinary man. And if you want to look into it a bit more, just go to Rich Wrap-Ups, and it's under Home Thoughts, because I read him once, and I don't know if I told you, I started really annoying my wife because I'd say, "Oh, you don't mean that." Indeed, she probably didn't. But it just means that at an elementary level, you can't work with this framework because life becomes very complex, but he's fascinating. Ultimately, the battle for the future of African rhinos can only be won in Asia. This is the WWF. And on that note, I'll put up the photograph of two male rhinos in Lewa, which we saw not too long ago when we went to watch the marathon. And I'll also put up a photograph of Kilimanjaro, the snow peaks that I took when I was going to Maputo. Jack Kerouac, On the Road, is one of my favorite books. The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, 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 like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars. Political Reflections, I'm going to put up a link for the ISIS Twitter handle. Made some extraordinary reading. And then Washington Post was making the point of the disconnect between the unnerving assessments of the Islamic State and the apparent lack of urgency in confronting it. John Kerry has said this is serious business. I think the world is beginning to come to grips with the degree to which this is unacceptable. So far, though, the Obama administration's response to the group's blitzkrieg through northern Iraq has been defined primarily by the limits it has placed on the US military's intervention. The complexity here is clearly they are very well funded, and I'll put up that link to that video, The End of Sykes Picot, which was really surreal and worthy of Peter Sellers, well worth watching, by the way. Go jump to 13 minutes. Where there's this extraordinary character talking about Barack Obama needing to send diapers for his military. It's mesmerizing. In fact, in terms of tone, to whom it's being directed, because here you have a very anglicized. You have an English-speaking individual. But I think the problem for President Obama is essentially these people have been funded by people like Saudi Arabia, strong allies of the US. Iraq and Syria's Poetic Borders is a piece by Elias Muhanna in the New Yorker, which is very interesting. The late historian and critic Tony Judt once described Europe before the First World War as an intricate, interwoven tapestry of overlapping languages, religions, communities, and nations. After the period between 1914 and 1945, as a result of war, ethnic cleansing and border drawing, a new, more stable Europe emerged, in which almost everybody now lived in their own country among their own people. 30 million were uprooted and dispersed by Stalin and Hitler between 1939 and 1943, a process that was repeated after the defeat of the Axis armies, Germans, Poles, Balts, Croats, Ukrainians, Hungarians, Slovaks, Romanians, Turks, and many others, was shunted around the continent. The result was a Europe of nation-states more ethnically homogeneous than ever before. Well, that's interesting, I suppose. And then asking, is it a similar process of nation formation taking place in Iraq and Syria today? I don't think so. I think it's an extraordinarily and irreversible fragmentation, in fact. The demographic map of the region is in flux, and analysts have wasted little time in declaring that the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham augurs the death of Sykes, Picot, the British-French treaty that established many of the Middle East's modern borders, its creations now unstitched and exposed in their artificiality. And then going back to that, the writer then is describing the video link about which I linked yesterday and I put in again today, and saying, dismantling the colonial Middle East is a narrative that ISIS itself has made a centerpiece of its propaganda, highly effective. A video posted on YouTube earlier this summer features a soft-spoken Chilean fighter named Abu Safia, hoisting ISIS's black banner up a flagpole at an abandoned checkpoint on the Iraqi-Syrian border. The flag flutters as a pathos-filled soundtrack swells, and the clip's title, The End of Sykes Picot, appears on the screen in a handsome sans serif font. Right now, we're on the side of al-Sham, or Syria, Abu Safia says, surveying the landscape, and you've got to watch it, because it's Peter Sellers' line. As you can see, this is the so-called border of Sykes-Picot. We do not recognize it, and we will never recognize it. What ISIS recognizes instead is a single borderless expanse comprising most of the Middle East, saying that the history of the region is one of variegation and multiplicity, and its indigenous geography has long recognized boundaries, territories, localisms, where the new caliph and his army see only the singularity of his rule. The euro is at 133.60. There was some weakness. GDP reports out of France and Germany, both soft. That sent 10-year Bund yields below 1% for the first time ever, by the way. Dollar index 81.64, pushing a little bit higher. I think it's, it's making a move here, as in the Shalimar song I spoke about a few weeks ago. And I think, pullbacks will be shallow as we progress higher, but it'll be a grinding type move. Japanese yen 102.60, Swissy 0.9077, pound below 167 at 166.80, Aussie 0.9296, Indian rupee 61.055, South Korean won 10.2343, the real 228.13. That suffered a bit of turbulence after the death of the presidential candidate, which I'll get to in a moment. Egyptian pound just below 7.15 at 7.1494. South African rand 10.58 to 72. That's firmed up a little bit. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index. On balance, I think we're headed up through 82 towards 82.50. Euro dollar 133.60. Very weak GDP data coming out of core Europe in the last 24 hours. Germany's 10-year Bund yield dropped below 1% for the first time on record. I'll put up a sterling chart. That's at 3-month lows versus the dollar, and I'm beginning to look at it again. Interesting report on Bloomberg how Antarctica glaciers melting because of global warming may push up sea levels faster than previously believed, potentially threatening megacities including New York and Shanghai. This is researchers in Germany, and then Bloomberg got a simulated photograph of skyscrapers submerged in water by Thomas Jackson of Getty Images. I'll put that up. Gold, that's been grinding higher, 13.29. I'll put up a 3-month chart. I still think 12.50, 12.40 is where we're going to go to, but obviously heightened geopolitical noise has lifted that. Crude oil has not been lifted at $96.45. I think it's a little bit of a trading buy now. Brazilian presidential candidate Campos killed in plane crash, and I concluded by saying planes have been falling out of the sky like flies in 2014. This is Eduardo. Campos was killed in a plane crash on Wednesday, throwing the October election and local financial markets into disarray. A private jet carrying Campos and his entourage crashed in a residential area in bad weather as it prepared to land in the coastal city of Santos. He was, however, 3rd place in the polls, but clearly if someone pulls out, it changes the dynamics. Brazilian financial markets initially slumped on the news of Campos's death and seesawed throughout the day, apparently. Bovespa ended 1.53% lower. After falling as much as 2%, the currency softened 0.53%. I'll put up a photograph of Eduardo Campos. Sub-Saharan Africa, I met a gentleman called Marco Annunziata, who is now the chief economist at General Electric, when I was in Milan at the conference held by Mr. Conforti's Advantage Financial, and I took this photo of Marco, and which I'm now tweeting. And at that conference, I was moderating a panel with Peter Mwangi and various others, Ragnar from the IMF, and it was most enjoyable, actually. And Marco tweeted me, because I was looking at some demographic numbers yesterday. Do you remember that report? And maybe I'm going to talk about it today, actually. And he was tweeting me back and then said to me, have you read? I said to him, well, I hope our paths cross, because Jeffrey Immelt was extremely bullish about Africa, the US-Africa summit. I picked up on some of his comments, and Marco replies on Twitter, Africa is a big bet and a big focus for us at GE. We released a paper at the summit, and he then proceeded to send me that paper called Growth and Governance in Africa Towards a Sustainable Success Story. And he's obviously the lead author of that. I went through it this morning, very interesting, saying African businesses poised to reap substantial rewards. They recognize the disruptive potential of accelerating innovation as the digital world meets the physical, and they are ready to become enthusiastic early adopters of new technologies. Most importantly, this is a tremendous opportunity for Africa's citizens to enjoy a rapid and sustained rise in living standards. He says Africa's transformation is not yet self-sustaining. Governance and institutions have improved significantly, but from a low starting point and lag other growth markets. The road ahead is long. We're optimistic. This is the time to bet on Africa, they say. After 2 decades of underperformance, starting in 2001, SSA exceeded world growth by an average of 2 percentage points per year. Since the great financial crisis, it has emerged as the second fastest growing region. Average annual growth rate of over 5%, closing in on emerging Asia. SSA accounts for just about 2% of global GDP, even though with over 900 million inhabitants, it is home to 13% of the world's population. This demographic trend poses a challenge to create rapid job growth, to safeguard social stability and ensure rising living standards, but also represents a tremendous opportunity for the development of a large middle class. Sub-Saharan Africa's trade with Asia has grown much faster than with any other region, overtaking trade with Europe in 2010 and reaching over a third of the region's total trade in 2013. China, the region's largest single trading partner, accounts for roughly half of that figure. Overall, Sub-Saharan Africa's share of fuels, unprocessed metals, raw agricultural materials out of total goods exports is about 55%. Nearly 1/2 of the region's exports are goods and services other than commodities, which is what's getting people excited, talking about a proposed bilateral investment treaty between the US and East Africa. FDI to SSA rose from 6.4 billion in 2000 to 42 billion in 2013. According to UN data, share of consumer-related greenfield projects in Africa rose from 7% in 2008 to a quarter of all projects in 2012, saying that there's been limited progress so far in developing a manufacturing sector. That's one of the key challenges. Development of a stronger manufacturing sector in Africa is impeded by 2 main factors: infrastructure bottlenecks, still weak and challenging business environments. It's a very good report, well worth reading. Talking about power generation being the greatest challenge. The entire region of approximately 900 million people generated roughly 15% less electricity than South Korea, with 50 million people in 2011. African business executives polled in the GE 2014 Innovation Barometer rank above the global average in their conviction that the meshing of the digital world with the physical world of machines is bringing about a new industrial revolution. I agree with that completely. The barometer shows that a strong majority, about 80% of business executives in Kenya, Nigeria and South Africa, see innovation as a positive force that has already helped raise living standards in their countries. They recognize that innovation is increasingly becoming a global game, that collaboration across small and large companies, universities and government organizations is essential to innovate successfully. Talks of the viral success of M-Pesa, the mobile banking and microfinancing system that quickly bypassed the relative underdevelopment of traditional banking, is a case in point. If policies keep moving in the right direction, the region's upside potential is enormous. The region's future could play out in one of 4 different scenarios, depending on the speed of progress in economic and governance reform. Africa ascending, back to the future, this is the worst case scenario, treading water, run and stumble. Talking about a lot more work being needed, well worth reading. It's linked on Rich Wrap-Ups if you want to go and have a look at that in full. UNICEF issued an interesting report, Generation 2030 Africa. It can be said there are 4 basic and primary things that the mass of people in a society wish for: to live in a safe environment, to be able to work and provide for themselves, to have access to good public health, and to have sound educational opportunities for their children. Isn't that an amazing description of what I think 7 billion souls want? Consider this, on current trends, almost 2 billion babies will be born in Africa in the next 35 years. Over the same period, Africa's under-18 population will increase by 2/3, reaching almost 1 billion by mid-century, and close to half of the world population of children will be African by the end of the 21st century. By 2050, they reckon population revisions now indicate that by mid-century the continent will be home to around 41% of all the world's births, 40% of all global under 5s, and 37% of all children under 18. Saying it's experienced a marked increase in its population. Current population is 5 times its size in 1950. Rapid population expansion is set to continue, with the inhabitants doubling from 1.2 billion to 2.4 billion between 2015 and 2050, eventually reaching 4.2 billion by 2100. The future of humanity is increasingly African. Africa will become increasingly crowded. Population density projected to increase from 8 persons per square kilometre in 1950 to 39 in 2015 and about 80 by mid-century. It's a fascinating, study of the demographic trends, and well worth having a look at. Actually, it's very in-depth. I participated in a short interview about the US-Africa Summit with Fountain Media. That link is on the website as well. South African oil share fell 0.35%. It's up 10.831% this year, not too far off a record high. Dollar rand, that's been a little bit firmer, 10.5876. Egyptian pound, 7.1488. Egyptian stock market up another 0.15%, a fresh multi-year high, up a mighty 36.95% this year. Nigerian oil share been on a bit of a losing streak, down 0.81% yesterday. It's up 1.025% this year. The Ghana Stock Exchange has also been on a losing streak, fell 0.82% yesterday. Stock market is up 4.475% only this year. I saw this tweet from Eva Bulens. Welcome to Ghana, where goats are even fed up with the Mahama government already, she tweeted, and I'll put up the image. Ghana's annual consumer price inflation rose to a 4-year high of 15.3% from 15% in June. It's going higher still. Mozambique has passed an amnesty law for the opposition leader ahead of the vote. Presidential candidate, Renamo presidential candidate Afonso Dhlakama. Parliament has approved an amnesty law that will allow Dhlakama to leave his hideaway in the bush, sign a peace accord with President Armando Guebuza, and run in an October 15th election. He is now expected to travel to the capital Maputo to sign a formal peace accord with Guebuza ahead of the October 15 election. On that note, I'll put up a link to the story I wrote on the 3rd of June. Mozambique could be the next Qatar. And I'll also put up 2 photographs, one of Pemba Island in Mozambique seen from the sky as we were coming into land or were taking off, and another one from the official photo shoot of the Africa Rising conference I attended, where you can see the President Armando Guebuza and Christine Lagarde, amongst many others. Interesting report by HVS. African Hotel Valuation Index reveals hotel rooms in Seychelles have the highest value. Survey of internationally branded properties covers 14 African markets. Hotels in the Seychelles demonstrated the highest value per room, $522,000. Lots of interesting data. Mutharika, the president of Malawi, says we're not going to war, but the lake has been ours for 104 years. The law is very clear. I think there is very little room for negotiations on the issue of the lake. But I think we will find a way to settle this with Tanzania, he said. Based on an 1890 colonial agreement, Malawi claims ownership of the whole of Lake Malawi, which is believed to hold both oil and gas reserves. Tanzania insists that half falls within its borders and is already eyeing it for natural gas exploration. People think there's plenty of gas down there. Mutharika said he met his Tanzanian counterpart Jakaya Kikwete during the US-Africa Summit in Washington last week and invited him to come and fish at the lake. I'll put up a photograph of Lake Malawi and also then talk about Sierra Leone's Ebola-hit Freetown as a city on the edge. You can imagine there would be. Death stalks the rain-lashed streets of Sierra Leone's capital, finally at peace after a decade of civil war, but in the grip of a new and equally deadly adversary, the Ebola virus. Nigerian port officials, I got this photograph from The Guardian, use a thermometer on a worker at the arrivals hall of Murtala Mohammed International Airport in Lagos. I'll put that photo up. Diamond Trust reported that its first half profit after tax accelerated 10.23964%. Loans and advances expanded 26.773%. Total assets up 25.877%. Profit before income tax up 17.2355%. Profit after tax up 10.23964%. Earnings per share up 7.091%. It's a well-organized bank. It's well-run. Rights issue was oversubscribed. Well, subscribed 440%. Earnings, however, seem to have decelerated a little. I'll put up a link for the official announcement, the rights issue, and I'll put up a photograph I took 153 days ago from Nasim's office. She's the CEO of Diamond Trust, looking towards Nairobi. I did an interview with Mahmoud Jan Mohammed of Serena Hotels. I think there's some good insights into frontier and sub-Saharan African tourism in that interview. I'll put up a link for the share price for TPS, and I'll put up a photograph of the party that was held at the Polana that time I was in Maputo by the IMF in their ballroom, rather grand. I'll put up a link for the interview I did with Charles Ireland of East African Breweries. That's a great insight into the East African community's beverage markets. He said at the earnings release, we've been around for 92 years, and indeed they have. And I'll put up a link for their full year results as well. And then finally I did another interview with Joshua Oigara. That's a good insight into the banking sector. African M-Pesa technology expands in Europe. This is a report in Agence France Presse. From East Africa to Eastern Europe, that's quite phenomenal when you think about it, Michael Joseph says. He heads Vodafone's mobile money business. I think this is something the rest of the world can look at to say that there are ideas that can emanate out of the developing world and take it to the developed world. Romania is the latest nation Vodafone is tapping with its first European launch. Technology has started out in Kenya as being exported to Europe. I'll put up a photograph of that M-Pesa shop that I took 825 days ago, a link for Safaricom's share price. Co-op Bank, in an interview given to Reuters, said our South Sudan subsidiary started operations in September, is on the verge of breaking even. And they're looking at going into Ethiopia and Uganda. I'll put up the link for that earnings release. Kenya shilling is above 88 at 88.10. Key level is 88.25. Keep an eye on that. Nairobi All Share up 13.0625% in 2014. Ticked 0.06% higher yesterday. NSE 20 ticked 0.27% lower yesterday, but it's closed above 5,000 every day since August 5. Needs to stay above that, of course. Samsung have opened an engineering academy in Nairobi. Interesting report about that. The All Share snapped a 4-session losing streak yesterday, edged higher to close at 154.50. NSE 20 lost 13.36 points, but as I said, it's been above 5,000 since August 5. and the last time it was above that level was January 29th. Equity turnover slowed down yesterday, signaling supply thinning out, which is normally positive. Do have a look at rich wrap-ups if you want to have any, if you want a deeper insight into what's been going on. Lots of results have been issued, lots going on at the stock market. Once again, thank you for stopping by. I am grateful.